What's going on, guys? Welcome back to Recapped. Today we're going to be looking at a film called The Cell from 2000 starring Jennifer Lopez. In this film, police can actually enter the minds of killers, and once inside they can find out important pieces of information, such as the location of a possible victim. But when our main character, Jennifer Lopez, enters the mind of a particular criminal, things go very dark, very fast. If you guys enjoy these videos, leave a like, hit that sub button if you're new, grab a snack, and let's begin. We open on our main character, Catherine, as she rides horseback through a vast desert. She hops off her horse and wanders through a desert until she finds a boy holding a pocket mirror. She thanks the boy for the horse and tells him that she thought they were sailing boats today. Edward, the child, conjures up a toy boat to play with, but then warns Catherine about the boogeyman. She tells him that they aren't going to worry about the boogeyman before the child morphs into a demonic child and runs away. Catherine then presses the button on her hand and we jump to the inside of a scientific observation room where Catherine and the boy lay suspended in the air, both unconscious. A panel of scientists watches from behind a window as the two wake up. We discover that Catherine is a psychologist and she was inside of Edward's head as they were having a session using a type of new technology that allows her to enter his brain. We jump to Edward's room and we see that he lives inside the psychology facility. He lays in his room in a coma that he fell into after some psychological trauma at a younger age. His parents visit him and tell the team of scientists that they're thinking of putting Edward in a hospital rather than waiting for him to get better here. We find out that Catherine has been working with Edward for 18 months and very little progress has been made. The father worries that the technology will never actually help Edward. We then jump to a man driving down a very open desert road. He pulls over to an old shack and two silos. He and his dog get out of his car and then enter the shack. They go downstairs where a dead woman floats in a box of water on display. The woman flinches, scaring the man, and the man drains the box of water. We jump back to the science facility where we learn that Catherine is granted 6 more months of working with Edward. She pushes to be able to put Edward in her brain with the technology rather than always her going into his brain. She believes it'll help Edward grow and get better, but the scientists believe it to be too risky. We jump back to the man in the desert. He loads the woman's dead body in his truck and takes off down the road. Later that night, we see the man washing off another dead body. At Catherine's house, she has a nightmare about being in Edward's mind and him becoming a monster. We find out that this traumatic incident was part of a sailing accident. Back at the killer's lair, we see him suspended over the woman's dead body. He hangs in the air by chains that are hooked into his skin all over his body. He watches another woman in one of his boxes start to drown on a set of security cameras. As he watches, he climaxes over the first woman's dead body. Disgusting. The next morning, we see a team of detectives investigating the woman's dead body, which was dumped in a ditch. The body reeks of bleach and wears a collar. We learn that this is the 7th dead woman that people have found like this. There is in fact a serial killer on the loose. We then see the serial killer, Carl, stalk his next possible victim. Across town, detectives Peter, Teddy, and Gordon discuss the case in a diner. We learn that there was a dog hair found on the victim's body. At the forensics lab, they discover that the killer's dog is albino after analyzing its hair. Later that night, we see Carl abduct the woman that he's been stalking all day. The next morning at the police station, Detective Peter leads a team of police investigators looking for the serial killer. He tells the team to look for who owns an albino dog and a Chevrolet car. As police search through the records, we learn that the killer was killing with months in between each kill, but now it's only a matter of days with each body they're finding. We see Detective Peter and Gordon visiting the home of the woman who Carl kidnapped a day before. We find that her name is Julia. Julia was living with her mother and fiance who have reported her missing. While interviewing Julia's family, Gordon gets a call that they've identified somebody who brought an albino shepherd and owns a Chevrolet. It's Carl. At Carl's house, he seemingly has a panic attack as he takes a bath. Detective Peter and Gordon surround Carl's house with SWAT teams. The teams breach and find the collapsed Carl laying on the floor. They find a lot of evidence pointing to Carl being the serial killer, but no Julia. They arrest Carl and take him to the hospital. As they go to Carl's home, they find the security tapes of a woman drowning in Carl's torture box. Somewhere else, we see Julia waking up inside the box. She yells for help, but no one is there to hear her. At the hospital, detectives Peter and Gordon find out that Carl has schizophrenia, and it was triggered in such a way today that Carl is in a type of catatonic state, where he's stuck in a dream state forever, almost like a coma. Peter then explains to the doctor that Carl keeps women in a cell for 40 hours before drowning them, and that a woman named Julia is somewhere trapped in one of those cells right now. Later, Peter explains the case to a team of scientists along with Catherine and her bosses, Miriam and Henry. We learn that if police don't find Julia tonight, then she will drown in the cell. Catherine decides to help the detectives by going into Carl's mind and using the technology. As scientists start the procedure, we learn that Catherine has a microchip in her hand and she can trigger and alert scientists to pull her out. Once in, Catherine wakes up to find herself in a dark, dank basement in Carl's mind. She notices a child running up the set of stairs and follows him into a lab where a horse stands. She tries to talk to the child version of Carl before he pushes her away as a timer goes off and the horse is cut into pieces. But what's even stranger is realizes that the horse is still alive and breathing. But then again, it is a dream. After saving her life, young Carl runs away. Catherine finds another room where all of Carl's victims are strung up and made to dance like marionettes. Catherine looks over the display and is knocked out by a large, muscular woman and is brought to a large man on a throne. He yells at her, asking her where she comes from, before Catherine presses the button on her hand in a panic. Back on the surface, Catherine wakes up and tries to recover from what's going on in Carl's mind. A scientist explains to Detective Peter that if Catherine goes too deep and starts to believe that Carl's mind is the real world, then her mind can convince her body that it's real as well. And if that happens, then anything that happens to her in Carl's head will actually happen to her body in real life. Later that day, Catherine visits Edward. Detective Peter talks to her and we learn that Edward suffers from schizophrenia as well. Catherine tells Peter that Carl isn't himself anymore. In his mind, he's an idealized version of himself, where he's a king ruling a twisted kingdom. She tells him that there's another version of Carl, the child version of him, that is actually the only positive side of him. She believes that if she could reach the child and gain his trust, he may be able to tell her where Julia is. The team then preps Carl for the catalyst and lets his dog lick his fingers as he goes under, believing that it'll relax him. Just as they're about to go under, the power goes out. The team tells a drowsy Catherine through the glass that she needs to check the circuit breaker. She gets up to check the circuit breaker and then realizes she's much smaller than she should be. She looks back and sees her unconscious body next to Carl's. She's already in his mind. Then, all of a sudden, she's trapped in a box. She breaks free of it and falls down onto a platform only to be greeted by Valentine, Carl's dog. She asks the dog to take her to Carl and then notices the child version of Carl running through the front door of a house in the distance. Catherine goes into the house and finds Carl washing dishes. She gives child Carl a pocket mirror as a gift, the same one that Edward was playing with at the beginning of the movie. He takes the mirror and accidentally drops a plate onto the floor and it shatters. He pushes Catherine into a closet and makes her hide as Carl's father yells at him about the plate and beats him. Catherine is forced to watch helplessly as Carl's father tortures him. Catherine then finds adult Carl washing the body of his first victim. He asks Catherine why he's here, and she tells him that she came to help him. He calls her a liar, and she asks about his dad. Carl then says in a demonic voice that he was nothing. It's revealed that Carl suffered a seizure during his baptism that happened in a lake after his father pushed him under. Catherine then asks Carl where Julia is, but he changes into a demonic version of himself. She tries to push the button on her hand, but he subdues her and places a collar around her neck. Back on the surface, the scientists read Catherine's brain scans and tell detectives that she believes Carl's mind is the real world. And further, they can't pull her out now because it may hurt her even more. The team decides to allow Detective Peter to go into Carl's mind with Catherine in an attempt to pull her out. After going into the machine, Peter wakes up in a shallow grave next to a group of women frozen in time. Peter then notices child Carl, who leads him to a room where Catherine is chained to a bed. Peter tries to tell her that none of this is real, but she kisses him instead. She distracts Peter until the king version of Carl knocks him unconscious. Peter wakes up strapped to a table. He calls out to Catherine, who smiles as she watches him. King Carl cuts Peter open and pulls his intestines out. Peter yells to Catherine and says that her younger brother got into a car accident when she was younger and it put him in a coma. This snaps her out of it. She realizes that none of this is real and she stabs King Carl in the back. The two then wake to find themselves in a room with child Carl. Child Carl stands next to a box of water with Julia's ghost swimming inside of it. She asks him where Julia is, but he doesn't know. Peter notices a symbol on the box and believes that he knows how to find her. He tries to tell Catherine that it's time to go, but Catherine wants to stay and help child Carl. Peter presses Catherine's button on her hand and they wake up on the surface back in reality. Peter then calls Detective Cole, who's at Carl's house, and tells him to go into the basement and look at the machine that Carl would strap women to. The machine has the same symbol that Peter saw in Carl's mind. It says Carver Equipment, Baker, California. Peter then rushes to a helicopter. Back inside, Catherine locks the scientists out of the room and sets up the system for Carl to now enter her mind. Inside her mind, she's a queen and sits on a throne as child Carl approaches her. They talk until the child Carl turns into adult Carl. Carl explains that one day he found a wounded bird and drowned it before his dad could find it, in fear that he would torture it. He then turns back into a child before telling Catherine that it found him. The scene around them then gets dark. Bugs appear everywhere as King Carl appears. Back on the surface, Peter gets a call from Cole, who tells him that the maker of the machine had gone bankrupt and the bank hired Carl to seal his building up. Peter assumes that the building is where Carl tortured his victims, and Peter flies to the address to meet up with Cole and save Julia. We intercut between reality and inside of Catherine's head as she beats King Carl and Peter arrives at the building to save Julia. Catherine tries to kill Carl, but he reveals to her that she can't kill him because he knows none of this is real. She then takes child Carl and slowly starts baptizing him in a small pool of water. Peter is able to find and save Julia before she drowns in the tank of water. Catherine then wakes up to reality and cries as Carl lays unconscious next to her. Later on, Catherine visits Carl's home where she finds Peter and a squad of investigators. The two talk, and Catherine tells Peter that she plans to treat Edward by letting him into her mind. Peter then tells her that on police reports, the police found Julia with old-fashioned detective work without outside help. In the last scene, we see Catherine playing with a toy sailboat inside of her mind with Edward as she treats him. And that is the end of the movie. Alright, well guys, that was quite a mind bender, but I hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know down below in the comments what you thought of this film. It definitely was pretty confusing and hard to follow at some points, but regardless, I do think it actually is a pretty decent movie, and it's very artistic and it's cinematic, and I can kind of see what they were trying to go for, despite not really popping off like the producers probably intended. Overall, it's a good movie, definitely worth checking out, and if you're like me and you've seen the horse scene when you were like 5 years old and it traumatized you, well, welcome to the club. Now you know which movie that's from. If you guys enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, hit that sub button if you're new, and until next time, I'll see you guys in the next video. Good night.